Close your eyes and step into a medieval city after nightfall. The sun has long set behind jagged rooftops, leaving only a pale moon to shine down on cobbled alleys slick with refuse and rainwater. A church bell tolls in the distance, deep and mournful, its echo rolling over timber houses and smoky taverns. Yet here, in the darker quarters of town, just beyond the cathedral square where holy sermons thundered hours ago, another sound rises. Laughter, hushed whispers, the clink of cups, and the creak of a wooden shutter being pulled back. This is the underworld of medieval life, a place where survival is traded for coin, where shame and necessity walk hand in hand, and where women, often abandoned, hungry, or cast aside, sell not just their bodies, but their very place in society. For some, it is a cage from which they will never escape. For others, it is a narrow, dangerous path toward a strange kind of power. Welcome to the hidden story of prostitutes in the medieval era. Before we go deeper, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about where you are right now as you listen to these words. Is it late at night with headphones on? Are you sitting on a bus, scrolling through your phone? Or maybe lying in bed, the glow of the screen the only light in the room? Drop your time and place in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world people are listening to these tales. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to Urgent Talks. Hit that like button if you love learning about the brutal, hidden truths of history. And share this with a friend who thinks the Middle Ages were only knights and castles. Trust me, what you're about to hear will change the way you picture medieval life forever. Now, step closer. Imagine the smell of spilt ale, damp straw, sweat, and wood smoke mixing in the narrow streets. Imagine the flicker of torches revealing painted faces at windows, the rustle of skirts, the low bargaining voices of men. This is the medieval red light district. It is easy to think of prostitution in these centuries as simple vice, but to the people who lived it, it was survival. Most women who ended up here did not dream of this life. They were daughters without dowries, widows without bread, wives abandoned by men who disappeared into wars. Some were sold or tricked into the trade, others coerced by innkeepers, brothel keepers, even by their own families. The medieval prostitute was rarely a woman of choice. She was a woman of necessity. But here lies the contradiction that makes her story so powerful. Society despised her, yet needed her. Priests thundered sermons calling her daughter of Eve, sewer of sin. Yet those same priests were sometimes seen sneaking through back alleys with coin in hand. Kings passed laws against her, yet their soldiers filled the brothels on campaign nights. Merchants and craftsmen cursed her presence, yet slipped into her bed when no one was looking. The necessary evil. The medieval world was built upon contradictions, and none more so than its view of prostitution. To the church, the prostitute was a sinner, a temptation, a living emblem of Eve's fall. Yet to city officials and kings, she was also a tool, an unpleasant necessity, but a necessity all the same. And so, while sermons thundered against lust, laws quietly carved out spaces for it. Step into Paris in the 14th century. The city is alive with merchants, scholars, nobles, and priests. The Cathedral of Notre Dame towers above the skyline, its bells summoning the faithful to confess their sins. But just a few streets away, municipal officers are writing out ordinances that regulate prostitution. Why? Because the officials have decided that it is better to control lust than to deny it. Without prostitutes, they argue, men would dishonor respectable women, threatening the stability of households and marriages. The church's thinkers put it another way. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas called prostitution a sewer, filthy, degrading, but essential. Without a sewer, the filth of a city would overflow into the streets. Without prostitutes, men's desires would spill into chaos, violence, and rape. Thus, the prostitute was condemned as a sinner, yet simultaneously seen as a guardian of order. This grim logic gave birth to the stews, licensed brothels recognized by city governments. In London's Southwark district, just across the Thames, such houses were tolerated for centuries. They were run by madams who paid rent to the Bishop of Winchester, which is why prostitutes there were often called Winchester geese. These women were despised in sermons, yet the bishop himself profited from their labor. In Avignon, when it was the seat of the papacy, prostitution flourished openly. Official brothels stood within sight of the papal palace. The irony could not have been greater. The holiest men in Christendom presiding over a city where the sex trade was organized, taxed, and thriving. But regulation came with humiliation. Prostitutes were required to wear markers of shame. Yellow hoods in Florence, striped cloaks in France, or in some German towns, bells on their belts so their presence could never be hidden. They were forbidden from living near churches, sometimes exiled to city edges, their quarters nicknamed the women's streets. Even within a brothel, they were reminded daily that their work set them apart from respectable society. Still, regulation gave them a form of protection. Thin, fragile, but real. Licensed prostitutes could not be arrested as easily as streetwalkers. They could appeal to city officers if cheated or beaten, though justice was rarely fair. Most importantly, they could at least count on having a roof over their heads, something countless poor women lacked. Yet the necessary evil argument was also cruel. By branding prostitutes as essential for male lust, medieval society excused the double standard that shamed women while forgiving men. A prostitute might be whipped, exiled, or branded for her sins, while her client walked away unpunished. A citizen free to visit his wife or attend mass without consequence. In this twisted balance, the prostitute's body became a battleground where morality, economics, and survival collided. She was despised, but she was needed. She was excluded, but she was central. She was condemned in sermons and yet maintained by laws. And so, night after night, the brothels opened their doors, the bells of the city rang out, and the necessary evil continued. An open secret woven into the very fabric of medieval life.
Falling into the trade. Picture a young girl born into a peasant family in the early 14th century. She grows up working in the fields, hauling water, scrubbing clothes in the river until her hands crack from the cold. Her family is poor, but clings to survival. Then, disaster strikes. A bad harvest leaves her parents hungry. Her father dies of fever, or perhaps disappears into war. Her mother remarries, but the new husband refuses to feed another mouth. Suddenly, she is left alone. A teenage girl with no dowry, no property, and no protection. In the medieval world, that was the beginning of a slow fall. A woman without a dowry could not marry. A woman without land could not live independently. Her options narrowed to servitude, begging, or selling her body. Many prostitutes of the medieval era entered the trade through poverty. Widows, abandoned wives, and orphans were especially vulnerable. Sometimes hunger drove them to desperate bargains. A loaf of bread in exchange for a night. A warm bed in exchange for surrender. But poverty was not the only trap. There was coercion. In many taverns and inns, women employed as servants or barmaids were forced into prostitution by the innkeepers who owned them. These men treated women as part of the entertainment, ale for the throat, flesh for the bed. Records from London, Lubeck, and Paris tell of young women lured to cities with promises of work, only to be pressed into brothels where they owed debts they could never repay. Even husbands sometimes forced their wives into sex work, sending them into brothels to earn coin for the household. Court records from France describe husbands accused of pimping their wives, though punishments were light. The shame always fell heavier on the woman than the man.
There were darker roots still. War and raids left villages burned and women scattered. Captured women were sometimes sold into prostitution as part of the spoils of conflict. The line between slavery and prostitution was often blurred in these moments. A woman displaced by violence might find herself trapped in a city brothel, unable to escape. Once inside the trade, escape was nearly impossible. The stigma clung like a curse. Even if a woman left prostitution, she carried the label for life. Marriage was nearly unthinkable unless she married another outcast, a criminal, a fellow worker, or a man so poor he had no choice. For respectable families, she was spoiled goods. And yet, not every woman was entirely without agency. Some, faced with starvation, made the deliberate choice to sell sex as the lesser evil. A woman who became a prostitute could at least earn money, perhaps even save enough to feed younger siblings, or keep herself from outright begging. To the outside world, she was damned, but to herself, she was surviving. This is what made medieval prostitution so tragic. It was rarely about lust and almost always about desperation. When a young woman walked the muddy streets in her marked hood or sat waiting in the dim light of a brothel, she carried behind her not only her body, but the heavy weight of poverty, abandonment, and coercion. And so the brothels filled, not with women who dreamed of sin, but with women who had nowhere else to go. The streets at night. As dusk settled over medieval towns, the streets transformed into a different world. By day, these narrow, twisting lanes were filled with vendors, bakers, and children darting between the bustle of carts. But at night, shadows crept across crooked timber-framed houses, and flickering oil lamps gave little light to the alleys where crime and secrecy thrived. It was in these darkened corners that many prostitutes earned their keep, especially those too poor to work in regulated brothels or under the protection of guilds. The town watch might patrol in groups, their halberds gleaming under the moonlight, but their presence was inconsistent. Often, they avoided the districts known for vice, preferring not to entangle themselves with the risks of violence, disease, or the disreputable figures who lurked there. This neglect allowed prostitutes, pimps, and thieves to claim the streets as their own once the market stalls closed. For a woman working the streets, the night was dangerous but necessary. Many had no dowry, no husband, and no trade to fall back on. Some were widows abandoned by fortune. Others, young women sent from the countryside seeking work who found themselves trapped by poverty. Selling one's body was often the only way to survive. Yet this survival came with a price: exposure to cold winters without shelter, vulnerability to assault, and a life lived under constant risk of both church condemnation and civic punishment. The interactions themselves were brief and harsh. Men, often drunk from taverns, stumbled into alleys with promises of a few coins. Sometimes these coins were copper farthings, barely enough to buy bread. Yet for the woman waiting in the shadows, they could mean another day of life. The risk of violence was omnipresent. A
Prostitutes stitched bright ribbons into their garments. Others painted their cheeks with rouge or used powdered chalk to whiten their skin. Jewelry, often cheap glass beads or brass trinkets, was worn to catch the eye in dim tavern life. For the poorest, however, clothes were patched, torn, and shared between women. Meals were simple and often scarce. Bread, pottage made from beans or cabbage, and occasionally salted fish or pork formed the staples. In brothels, food was sometimes provided by the keeper, but it came at a cost deducted from the women's earnings. Wine and ale were common, both as part of meals and as tools of the trade. Drunkenness dulled clients' suspicions and fears, and sometimes dulled the women's own pain.
As the afternoon turned to evening, preparations began for work. Women painted their faces again, adjusted their clothing, and in brothels gathered in common halls where music and drink softened the atmosphere for incoming customers. In the streets, prostitutes staked out places near taverns, markets, or city gates, calling out to men or waiting silently in shadows depending on their style and reputation. The work itself varied from quick exchanges in alleys to longer encounters in rented rooms. In brothels, madams negotiated prices, often charging extra for younger or more attractive women. A portion of every coin went to the house, leaving the prostitute with only a fraction of her labor's value. On the streets, bargaining was direct, sometimes desperate. A hungry woman might agree to service for the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. After each encounter, there was no medical care, no protection, and no privacy. Women wiped themselves clean as best they could, sometimes with vinegar-soaked cloths, believing it killed disease. Herbs like pennyroyal or juniper were used to prevent pregnancy, though with little effect. Some inserted sponges soaked in vinegar or wine into their bodies, crude attempts at contraception. The fear of pregnancy loomed constantly, for many children were born and raised in the same harsh cycle, often growing up within brothels or on the margins of society. Money, when it came, was handled with care. A few coins might mean the difference between starvation and survival. Some women hid their earnings in hems of dresses or tied them in cloths around their waists to prevent theft by pimps, clients, or even fellow prostitutes. Debts to brothel keepers or tavern owners ate away at their gains, binding many into a form of economic servitude. Only a small handful ever saved enough to leave the trade behind. By late night, exhaustion set in. In brothels, women retreated to shared rooms, often 4 or 5 to a bed, whispering to each other in the dark about clients, fears, or dreams of escape. On the streets, prostitutes crawled into rented corners of taverns or slept in barns, vulnerable to assault even in their rest. Sleep was rarely deep. Danger lurked at every hour. The daily routine was not without moments of humanity. Women comforted each other when beaten by clients, shared food when one had none, and sang songs to pass long nights waiting for business. Some maintained relationships with lovers or regular clients who offered companionship, though such bonds were fragile in the face of poverty. Others raised children with the help of fellow prostitutes, forming makeshift families within brothels. Above all, routine was shaped by survival. Every morning brought the same calculations: how to eat, how to stay warm, how to avoid punishment, and how to earn enough to endure another day. There was little room for leisure, but there was resilience. These women endured not because their lives were easy, but because necessity gave them no choice. Their daily routines, filled with hardship, were also filled with the quiet strength of those who lived on the edges of society, yet refused to vanish. Pimps, keepers, and enforcers, Behind every prostitute's daily struggle in the medieval era stood a network of figures who controlled, exploited, and sometimes shielded them. These were the pimps, keepers, and enforcers, individuals who profited from women's bodies while claiming to offer protection. For many prostitutes, life was less about independence and more about surviving under the authority of these figures. The most visible figure was the brothel keeper, often a woman known as the madam. Some had once been prostitutes themselves, rising to positions of power after years in the trade. Others were widows or business-savvy women who recognized profit in managing houses of prostitution. The madam negotiated with city officials, paid taxes or bribes, and kept order among the women. But she also demanded rent, food costs, and a portion of every coin earned. For the women inside, her word was law. Refusal meant expulsion, and expulsion often meant starvation. Not all brothel keepers were women. In many towns, men operated as the official hosts of municipal brothels. In Nuremberg, for example, civic authorities directly oversaw Frauenhäuser, where women were essentially municipal property. The men who managed these houses ensured the women obeyed curfews, wore their distinctive clothing, and did not stray into respectable districts. Though they called it protection, it was really control, strict, profitable, and merciless. Beyond regulated brothels, pimps dominated the lives of street prostitutes. These men, sometimes called ruffians or bullies, were both guardians and tormentors. They promised to shield women from violent clients or rival gangs, but their protection came at a cost, most of the prostitutes' earnings. Refusal was rarely an option. A woman without a pimp was easy prey in the alleys, robbed or beaten by thieves who knew she had no one to defend her. Thus, many submitted to pimps, even as they resented their cruelty. Pimps often demanded loyalty through fear. Beatings were common if a woman withheld coin. Some forced prostitutes to work longer hours, forbidding them to rest until enough silver was collected. Others used psychological control, convincing women they were worthless without their protector. In some cases, pimps doubled as lovers, twisting affection into dependence. A woman might stay with an abusive man because he offered a shred of companionship in a world that despised her. Enforcers, too, played a role. These were men, sometimes hired thugs, sometimes members of the town watch, who ensured prostitutes followed the rules. In regulated brothels, enforcers threw out unruly clients, but they also punished women who broke house rules. A prostitute who refused a client or attempted to keep extra coin could be beaten, locked in a cell, or cast out. In cities where prostitution was temporarily banned, enforcers rounded up women, driving them from the streets with whips or pikes. Church and civic authorities used their own forms of control. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing, restricting their movements. Officials imposed curfews, barring them from public markets or churches during daylight hours. Some towns even auctioned off the right to manage prostitutes to private citizens, effectively turning women into taxable commodities. In this way, entire legal systems functioned like giant pimps, profiting while enforcing strict boundaries. Yet not all keepers and pimps were monsters. Records reveal occasional glimpses of complicated bonds. Some madams provided food, shelter, and even dowries to women who wished to marry and leave the trade. A few pimps defended their women fiercely against abusive clients, treating them more like family than property. Such relationships, however, were rare exceptions, often overshadowed by exploitation. For prostitutes, navigating these power structures required constant calculation. A woman might submit to a pimp to survive the streets, or accept the madam's authority to avoid homelessness. Others tried to play one master against another, seeking small freedoms where possible. But ultimate control rarely lay in their hands. The men and women who stood above them decided prices, rules, and punishments. Violence was an ever-present shadow. In some towns, pimps formed gangs, clashing with rivals over territory. Prostitutes were caught in the middle, pressured to change allegiance or serve whichever gang dominated their street. Brothel raids by moral reformers sometimes led to public beatings, with pimps and prostitutes alike humiliated in the square. Still, some women managed to use these structures to their advantage. By aligning with powerful pimps or cooperative madams, they gained stability in an unstable world. A strong protector might shield them from town watch harassment or ensure regular clients. Though such arrangements often came at a high price, they offered a sliver of security in a life otherwise filled with danger. The reality was grim. Pimps, keepers, and enforcers profited from the vulnerability of prostitutes. They controlled where women worked, how they dressed, whom they served, and how much they earned. In theory, they provided protection. In practice, they perpetuated exploitation. For the women trapped in this system, survival often meant bowing to those who claimed ownership over their bodies. And yet, within this harsh world, resilience endured. Women whispered secrets about hiding coin, outwitting pimps, or fleeing abusive brothels. They built alliances among themselves, small acts of resistance that defied those who sought to break them. Though pimps and keepers claimed power, it was the prostitutes who carried the daily burden of survival, shaping lives in the cracks between exploitation and endurance. The double standard of morality. In medieval society, prostitutes lived under the heavy shadow of contradiction. On the one hand, they were branded as sinners, condemned from pulpits, painted as tools of the devil, and punished in civic courts. On the other hand, their very existence was tolerated, even encouraged, because the same society that denounced them needed them. This paradox was perhaps the most defining feature of a prostitute's life in the Middle Ages: to be despised, yet indispensable. Religious authorities thundered against them. Priests and monks wrote sermons that likened prostitutes to gateways of hell, whispering temptresses who lured men from virtue into damnation. Theologians cited St. Augustine, who had once claimed that prostitution was like the sewer of a great house, disgusting yet necessary to keep the rest of the structure clean. Without prostitutes, they argued, men would prey upon honorable women, wives, daughters, nuns. Thus, paradoxically, prostitutes were cast as both the corrupters of men and the guardians of women's chastity. In cities across Europe, this contradiction became policy. Municipal brothels were sanctioned by law, even as preachers condemned them from the steps of cathedrals. A city council might pass a decree forbidding prostitutes to walk near churches or markets, yet in the same breath regulate the hours of brothel operation, tax the madams, and even build red light districts to contain them. The message was clear: society would tolerate sin as long as it could be controlled, confined, and made to serve the larger social order. This double standard was not just institutional, but deeply personal. Men who would never dare be seen talking to a prostitute in daylight might visit her in the shadows of night, slipping coins into her hand and crossing themselves afterward in shame. Knights, merchants, and students who railed against immorality in public were among the most loyal customers behind closed doors. Some even brought gifts, promises, or confessions, creating moments of intimacy that mocked the public scorn prostitutes endured. For women, the hypocrisy cut deeper. Wives and mothers were told to guard their virtue at all costs, to be silent, obedient, and chaste, while prostitutes were scorned as having none of these virtues. Yet in practice, the line between respectable woman and fallen woman was fragile. A widow who struggled to feed her children, a servant girl seduced and abandoned, a wife accused of adultery. Any could be pushed into prostitution, whether by necessity or by accusation. Once branded, there was rarely a path back to respectability. The shame was permanent, even if the woman repented. Festivals revealed this hypocrisy most clearly. During Carnival, when rules of society turned upside down, prostitutes might parade openly in the streets, courted by men who mocked chastity with lewd songs. In taverns, men laughed and drank with them, treating them as equals for a few hours. Yet, when the festival ended, the same men would spit in their direction, and priests would warn that anyone who consorted with them would rot in hell. The mask of tolerance was only temporary, hiding the same old disdain. The church itself embodied the contradiction. While friars and monks condemned prostitution, some religious institutions quietly profited from it. Documents survive showing rents collected from brothel houses owned by bishops. Clerics themselves were frequent clients, despite vows of chastity. This open secret bred cynicism. Prostitutes knew that even the holy men who damned them were not immune to desire. For them, salvation was always out of reach, while hypocrisy thrived at every level above them. Perhaps the most tragic effect of this double standard was its impact on dignity. Prostitutes were told they were impure, unworthy of sacraments, incapable of grace. Yet in the shadows of confessionals, some priests listened to their sins, offered absolution, and took their money. The same woman who might be denied burial in consecrated ground if she died suddenly was nonetheless a taxpayer, a regulated worker, and a hidden necessity. It was a life caught between visibility and invisibility, between tolerance and damnation. And yet, many prostitutes learned to live with this contradiction by wielding it as a kind of shield. They knew that society could not fully do without them, and so they carved out small spaces of freedom within the hypocrisy. Some mocked their clients in private, noting that the same men who beat their wives came to them begging for tenderness. Some found a twisted empowerment in knowing that the upright merchant or the devout cleric revealed his secret self only in their presence. Others embraced the role fate had dealt them, living boldly in the margins, flaunting their beauty, and making the most of the little power they could command. The double standard of morality was the cage that surrounded them, but within that cage, some women sang, some whispered, and some endured in silence, knowing that the very men who despised them were the reason they survived. Daily survival, food, shelter, and clothing. For prostitutes in the medieval era, survival was an everyday calculation. Life was not lived in sweeping arcs of destiny, but in small, fragile details. What to eat that day, where to sleep that night, whether one had a cloak thick enough to keep out the winter wind. Though historians often focus on the laws, brothels, or moral debates surrounding prostitution, the women themselves lived in a world where bread, shelter, and clothing were the difference between life and death. Food was rarely guaranteed. In the largest cities, prostitutes who worked in municipal brothels might receive a ration of bread, beans, or ale from the madam, paid for with part of their earnings. But more often than not, a prostitute had to buy her own food, using coins left from her nightly customers after the brothel's cut had been taken. For those who worked independently, especially in smaller towns or villages, Payment could be uncertain. Some clients paid in bread, meat, or grain instead of coin, leaving women to trade what they could not consume. Meals were simple and monotonous. Black bread, thin pottage, onions, cheese if fortune smiled. On rare occasions, a generous might find herself robbed, beaten, or left unpaid after providing her services. Some tried to carry knives or sharpened pins hidden in their garments, but few could truly protect themselves against larger, stronger men. Not all street prostitutes worked alone. Small groups of women sometimes joined forces, both for safety and for bargaining power. Together, they could call out to passers-by, offer themselves for shared prices, and ward off attackers with numbers. Still, even in groups, the dangers were relentless. Rival gangs, pimps, or even jealous wives could bring violence down upon them. Night also blurred the lines between survival and exploitation. Some women were forced into prostitution by men who acted as their protectors, but were in reality brutal masters who took most of their earnings. Others were children, some no more than 12 or 13, sold or abandoned into the trade by desperate families. The darkness of the medieval night concealed much that polite society pretended not to see, even though everyone knew it existed. Despite the hardship, there was demand. Pilgrims arriving at holy shrines, knights returning from campaigns, and traveling merchants all sought out prostitutes in unfamiliar towns. Ironically, in many pilgrimage centers, such as Santiago de Compostela or Avignon, prostitution thrived openly alongside religious devotion. Town authorities sometimes even tolerated the trade at night because it kept men away from respectable women. To them, prostitutes were a necessary evil, tolerated as a safeguard for the virtue of wives and daughters. The atmosphere of these nocturnal exchanges was thick with smells: cheap wine, unwashed bodies, rotting garbage from the day's market, and the smoke of tallow candles burning in distant windows. Rats scurried across cobblestones, and the uneven glow of moonlight revealed the warped faces of men hunting for release and women bargaining for survival. The cold seeped into bones, especially in winter, when women huddled together with cloaks too thin to fight the chill. Every encounter carried the risk of disease. Before the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, other illnesses already haunted prostitutes: leprosy, skin infections, and venereal diseases that left sores and suffering. After the late 15th century, syphilis added another cruel burden. Prostitutes, already stigmatized, were often blamed as spreaders of disease, even though their clients came from all walks of life, merchants, monks, and noblemen included. Street work also meant constant tension with the church. Priests thundered from pulpits about sin and damnation, warning that women of the night would burn in eternal fire. Yet contradictions abounded. Some priests themselves were caught visiting prostitutes, their hypocrisy ignored or quietly pardoned by the church so long as it was not scandalous. For the prostitutes themselves, survival often came first, and confession could be a ritual way of seeking forgiveness on Sundays before returning to the streets on Mondays. By dawn, when the bells rang for morning mass, the women often retreated. Some collapsed onto straw pallets in rented hovels, exhausted and aching. Others hid themselves away, avoiding respectable townsfolk who scorned them. The cycle would repeat the next night, a rhythm of hunger, danger, and fleeting exchanges in the shadows. It was a life lived on the edge, balanced between society's dependence and rejection. The streets at night were not just a place of business, they were a theater of contradictions where morality, desperation,
Desire and survival collided beneath the flicker of weak torches and the silent judgment of stone churches looming over every alley.
Inside the medieval brothel. While many prostitutes scraped a living from the dangers of the streets, others worked inside officially sanctioned brothels, houses of prostitution often tolerated or even operated under civic control. These establishments offered a strange mixture of security, exploitation, and hypocrisy, reflecting the contradictions of medieval society's attitude toward sex work. Brothels were not hidden dens in shadowed alleys. In many towns, they were public institutions with specific rules, locations, and even signs. Authorities argued that if prostitution could not be eliminated, it was better to regulate it, confining the practice to controlled environments that protected respectable households from unwanted advances. The logic was simple. Better that men seek out prostitutes than dishonor the wives and daughters of citizens. A regulated brothel might stand near the town's margins, sometimes by riversides or at the gates, but close enough for travelers to find easily. In Paris, the Rue de la Boucherie became infamous for its concentration of brothels, while in South German cities like Nuremberg or Augsburg, municipal councils maintained official women's houses. Prostitutes living there paid rent and, in return, received some protection from harassment by the watch or church inquisitors. The interiors varied depending on wealth. A prosperous brothel might have several rooms with heavy wooden furniture, shutters to block prying eyes, and a communal hall where clients were entertained before private encounters. Tapestries or painted walls added a hint of luxury, though often faded or stained. In poorer establishments, rooms were little more than bare chambers with straw mattresses, their air thick with the smell of sweat, candles, and stale ale. The brothel was not just a place for sex. It was a small economy. Women who lived there paid fees to the madam or keeper, who, in turn, paid taxes or bribes to city officials. Ale, food, and sometimes even clothing were sold inside, binding the women further into cycles of debt. A prostitute might find herself forced to continue working simply because she owed rent or the cost of meals to the brothel itself. In this way, regulation offered a thin illusion of safety while often trapping women into servitude. Despite this, brothels provided advantages over the street. A woman inside had shelter against the cold, a bed to sleep on, and the presence of others for companionship and some degree of defense. Clients who misbehaved could be thrown out or barred, though the power to enforce such rules always rested with the keeper rather than the women themselves. Brothel life was deeply hierarchical. The madam, sometimes a former prostitute herself, wielded authority. She managed the accounts, dealt with officials, and set prices. Beneath her were the women, who had little say in governance, but carried the burdens of labor. Younger, more attractive women often received higher-paying clients, while older ones were relegated to poorer men or cheaper services. Competition among the women could be fierce, with jealousy and rivalry simmering beneath the surface. Music, drink, and performance often accompanied brothel activity. Musicians might be hired to entertain clients while they chose companions, and prostitutes themselves sometimes sang or danced as part of the allure. Brothels blurred the line between tavern, theater, and sexual marketplace, a place where medieval men could indulge in fantasies away from the watchful eyes of wives and priests. Yet even regulated houses faced scorn.
Church preachers railed against them as dens of sin. Civic records sometimes reveal periodic closures, particularly around holy festivals, when authorities attempted to cleanse the town of vice. Women were often forced to wear distinctive clothing, such as striped hoods or special badges, marking them as prostitutes, even outside the brothel. This branding ensured that society's stigma followed them wherever they went. Punishment awaited those who broke brothel rules. A woman caught working outside her designated house or refusing to pay her dues could be flogged, fined, or driven out of town. Some were forced to walk the streets half naked as public humiliation, while others were imprisoned in towers reserved for loose women. Such punishments reinforced their status as outcasts, even while society profited from their presence. Despite the hardships, some women carved out small communities inside these houses. They shared food, helped each other with clothing or illness, and sometimes even raised children together. It was not uncommon for prostitutes to have infants or toddlers living in the brothel, evidence of both vulnerability and resilience. Life here was not solely despair. It was survival, sisterhood, and the faint hope of securing enough coin to one day leave. Ironically, brothels sometimes stood close to churches or even monasteries. Clergy and monks were frequent clients, a fact that authorities tolerated as long as scandals did not become too public. Documents from Basel, Avignon, and Florence reveal that churchmen were among the most regular visitors. This double standard, condemnation from the pulpit but indulgence in private, was one of the bitter truths prostitutes had to endure. Brothels thus represented both the cage and the shield, a place where women were confined, marked, and exploited, yet where they also found a measure of protection from the chaos of the streets. Inside those walls, they laughed, wept, quarreled, and endured together, bound to necessity to a profession that society both despised and demanded.
The laws, bans, and punishments. The laws, bans, and punishments. The life of a prostitute in the medieval era was shaped not only by the brothel walls or the shadows of the streets, but also by the shifting hand of the law. Civic councils, kings, and the church all sought to regulate, punish, or occasionally protect them, depending on the winds of politics, morality, and necessity. The result was a life lived under constant uncertainty, where a woman could be tolerated one day and driven out the next. Across Europe, prostitution existed in a paradoxical legal space. On one hand, it was condemned as sinful, associated with lust, disease, and the corruption of souls. On the other, it was viewed as a necessary evil, a safeguard that kept honorable women safe from seduction or assault. Authorities tried to balance these views by allowing prostitution to exist, but only under strict regulation. Many towns designated special districts, often called red light areas today, though medieval people used other terms, where prostitution was permitted. In South German towns, these were called Frauenhäuser, or women's houses, essentially municipal brothels under civic oversight. Prostitutes working outside these zones risked arrest, fines, or public punishment. Laws often dictated the clothing prostitutes must wear, marking them clearly as women of the trade. In Florence, they were forced to display yellow veils or sashes. In Nuremberg, striped hoods. In London, a special badge. These laws ensured they could not be mistaken for honorable women, branding them as perpetual outsiders. For a prostitute, even stepping into the wrong part of town or dressing too finely could bring swift retribution.
Public punishment was common and brutal. A woman caught working illegally might be paraded through the streets half naked, beaten with rods, or locked in the stocks while townsfolk hurled insults and rotten food at her. some cases, her head would be shaved, a visible mark of disgrace. If she persisted in breaking laws, she could be banished from the city entirely, cast adrift with no means of survival except to start again in another town. At times, entire cities sought to cleanse themselves of vice. During Lent or other holy festivals, councils ordered prostitutes to leave the walls until the celebration ended. In Paris, expulsions were frequent in the late 14th century when moral reform movements gained traction. Yet these bans rarely lasted long. Once the festivities ended, the same authorities quietly allowed prostitution to resume, recognizing that the demand never vanished. The church played a powerful role in shaping legal attitudes. Priests thundered against prostitutes from the pulpit, calling them daughters of Eve and vessels of sin. Canon law declared prostitution a mortal offense, and prostitutes were denied burial in consecrated ground unless they repented before death. Yet hypocrisy abounded. Bishops and abbots sometimes collected rents from brothel houses, and countless records show clergy themselves as regular clients. Confession offered prostitutes a strange form of negotiation with the church. A woman might visit confession to unburden her sins, only to return to her trade the following day. Some priests demanded acts of penance, whippings, pilgrimages, or fasting as conditions for absolution. In extreme cases, repentant prostitutes entered convents, trading one life of confinement for another. A handful even became celebrated saints, though such transformations were the rare exception rather than the rule. Royal laws varied widely. In England, Edward III tolerated prostitution in Southwark, just across the Thames from London, where licensed brothels flourished under the Bishop of Winchester's control. The women there were known as Winchester geese, but under Henry VIII, during his moral reforms of the 16th century, these same brothels were shut down, their women driven into the streets. The cycle of tolerance and crackdown continued in every realm. Legal documents also reveal attempts to control disease. When outbreaks of plague or syphilis swept through cities, prostitutes were often scapegoated as spreaders of contagion. Some councils ordered mass expulsions, driving them out as though purging the sickness itself. In reality, disease knew no boundaries of class. Noblemen, clergy, and merchants all spread it as readily as the women they condemned. There were also laws aimed at protecting prostitutes, though usually to protect men from scandal rather than the women themselves. In some towns, clients who refused to pay could be prosecuted, a rare instance where the prostitute's word carried weight in court. But more often than not, justice was stacked against them. The cruel irony of these laws was their inconsistency. A woman could spend years paying taxes to a regulated brothel, only to see the council suddenly outlaw her profession and drive her into the wilderness. She might then wander to the next town, where the cycle began again. To be a prostitute in the medieval era was to live at the mercy of laws written by men who depended on you but despised you, tolerated you but punished you, and whose judgments could shift overnight with the tides of morality and power. For many, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. And so they endured, balancing on the thin edge of society's approval and condemnation, forever marked by laws that branded their bodies as both necessary and damned. Daily routines of a medieval prostitute. The daily life of a prostitute in the medieval era was not glamorous or romantic as some later tales would suggest. It was instead a rhythm of survival, dictated by the turning of the sun and moon, the laws of the city, and the demands of clients. From waking on coarse bedding to facing the night's dangers, every moment required vigilance and endurance. Mourning in a brothel or a rented chamber
began with the aftermath of the night before. The air was heavy with smoke from tallow candles, sour wine, and unwashed bodies. Straw mattresses were often damp with sweat or fleas, forcing women to shake out their bedding or spread it in the sun when possible. Cleanliness was a challenge. Most prostitutes did not have access to fresh water every day. Instead, they wiped themselves with rough linen cloths, sometimes soaked in vinegar or herbs, believed to mask odors and ward off disease. In towns with bathhouses, some women bathed more regularly, but even then, it was a luxury they could not always afford. Clothing was both armor and advertisement. By law, in many towns, prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive markers, yellow hoods, striped dresses, or certain veils, so that no one could mistake them for honorable women. Yet, within those limits, many tried to make themselves appealing. Some client might buy roasted meat, sweet pastries, or spiced wine, luxuries that lingered in memory long after hunger returned. Yet, hunger was constant, gnawing not only at the belly, but also at dignity. Many prostitutes knew what it was to go to bed empty, their bodies too tired to tempt another customer, their purses too light to buy even a crust of stale bread. Shelter was another challenge. Brothels provided beds, though bed often meant nothing more than a straw-filled mattress in a cramped room shared by 2 or 3 women. Sheets were rarely changed. Straw grew damp with sweat and rain, and lice or fleas were constant companions. In winter, fires were rationed. Madams were careful not to spend too much wood or coal. Prostitutes often huddled together for warmth, their breath misting in the cold air. Privacy was a rare luxury, and sleep was often interrupted by late-arriving clients, fights, or drunken songs from the street below. For those who lived outside of brothels, conditions could be even harsher. Some rented single rooms in taverns, squeezed between rowdy drinkers and traveling merchants. Others lodged in crumbling tenements where rain seeped through the roof and rats prowled in the night. The poorest sometimes slept in stables, barns, or under city gates, curling up against walls to ward off the chill. Homelessness was not uncommon. If a prostitute fell ill, failed to pay rent, or displeased her madam, she could be thrown out with nowhere to go but the streets. Clothing was both necessity and advertisement. Prostitutes needed to dress in ways that marked them as distinct from respectable women, but their attire also served as bait to attract customers. Laws in many towns required them to wear identifying garments, yellow veils in Florence, striped cloaks in England, distinctive hoods in Paris. These regulations marked them publicly as fallen women, but also gave them a strange kind of visibility, a walking sign that they were available for hire. Despite these restrictions, many tried to inject beauty into their appearance. They wore bright colors when they could afford them, laced bodices tight, and lined their eyes with soot. Some adorned themselves with ribbons, beads, or cheap jewelry, hoping to catch the gaze of passers-by. Shoes were a constant problem. Leather was costly, and many women wore patched sandals or went barefoot, their feet calloused from cobblestones. In winter, when icy winds cut through the streets, a cloak was as precious as gold. Without one, illness was almost certain. The constant struggle to maintain appearance led to endless compromises. A prostitute might spend her last coin on rouge for her cheeks rather than bread, knowing that a touch of color could attract the next paying customer. Others bartered directly with tradesmen, offering themselves to tailors, cobblers, or hatters in exchange for garments. Some garments were stolen. Thieves often targeted laundry lines or second-hand stalls, where a desperate woman might snatch a tunic and vanish into the alleys. Bathing was rare and perfume expensive.
To mask the smells of sweat, smoke, and unwashed bodies, prostitutes rubbed herbs into their hair, chewed parsley or mint to freshen breath, or sprinkled rose water when they could obtain it. The mingling of perfume, ale, and sweat was a scent both familiar and inescapable in their lives. Yet, even in the harshness of daily survival, there were moments of small triumph. A loaf of warm bread shared between friends, a heavy cloak purchased after weeks of saving, its wool scratchy but life-saving, a new dress that made heads turn in the marketplace. These fleeting comforts gave meaning to long nights and empty mornings. For women whose dignity society stripped away, the ability to clothe themselves, to eat well even once a week, or to close the shutters on a rented room gave them a fragile sense of control over their own lives.
Still, survival was never secure. Illness could rob them of income, leaving them to beg. Harsh winters killed many who had no shelter. Hunger pushed some into theft, which brought whipping or worse. For every prostitute who managed to maintain a modest, precarious existence, many more teetered on the edge of starvation. Daily life was a fragile thread, spun not from luxury, but from the barest essentials: bread, shelter, and clothing, won through their bodies and lost in an instant to misfortune. Disease, medicine, and the body's toll. The life of a medieval prostitute was a life lived in a constant state of bodily risk. While hunger and violence shaped daily existence, it was disease that most often stalked them in the shadows. In an age when medicine was primitive, sanitation poor, and superstition stronger than science, prostitutes bore the brunt of ailments that not only ravaged their bodies, but also marked them with shame. Illness was not simply an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence, and few escaped unscathed. The body as battleground. Prostitution placed enormous strain on the human body. Nights were long, sleep short, and clients unpredictable. Many prostitutes worked well into dawn, their bodies aching from repeated use, their throats raw from smoke-filled taverns, their muscles sore from sleeping on straw pallets. Women bore bruises from rough customers, cuts from drunken brawls, and infections from unsanitary conditions. Even when not visibly injured, their bodies aged quickly. Chronic fatigue, tooth loss, and hair thinning marked women who were still young in years, but old in appearance. Venereal disease before syphilis. While the infamous syphilis epidemic erupted only in the late 15th century, medieval prostitutes already faced a host of sexually transmitted diseases. Chronic gonorrhea, chancres, genital ulcers, and painful discharges were all described in medieval medical texts, though not understood as infections in the modern sense.
These illnesses spread quickly in brothels, where multiple clients visited the same woman in a single night. Because no effective cures existed, many women lived with constant pain, burning urination, or sores that never fully healed. The stench of untreated infections was difficult to hide, and some prostitutes were cast out by madams when illness made them less profitable. Pregnancy and childbirth. Disease was not the only risk. Unwanted pregnancies were frequent and contraception unreliable. Herbs such as pennyroyal, rue, or juniper were taken as abortifacients, but these often poisoned women as much as they prevented birth. Some midwives offered secret remedies, but few were safe, and many women died in the attempt. Those who carried pregnancies to term faced childbirth without adequate care. A prostitute who gave birth was rarely allowed to raise her child. Infants were often abandoned, given to foundling homes, or perished in infancy. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies and miscarriages left many women weak, malnourished, and vulnerable to other illnesses. Beyond sexual disease and pregnancy, prostitutes shared the wider burdens of medieval poverty: tuberculosis, leprosy,
fevers, dysentery, and plague. The Black Death of the 14th century decimated brothels along with the rest of society, killing thousands of women whose trade made them especially exposed to infection. Leprosy carried a unique stigma. Though rare, any prostitute who showed skin lesions could be accused of carrying it, driving her into exile. Even minor ailments, an infected tooth, a festering cut, a seasonal fever, could become fatal. The lack of hygiene in brothels, the scarcity of nutritious food, and the demands of their work all weakened their immune systems. Many did not live past their 30s.
Medicine and superstition. What medical care existed was fragmented between official physicians, barber surgeons, midwives, and folk healers. Wealthy prostitutes, those with powerful clients, might occasionally afford a learned doctor. He would examine the urine, pulse, or complexion, and prescribe purgatives, bloodletting, or costly imported drugs. But for most women, medicine came in the form of cheap herbs, charms, or whispered prayers. Herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary were burned to cleanse the air. Garlic was eaten to ward off sickness. Amulets inscribed with holy words were tied around waists to prevent disease of the womb. Prostitutes often turned to midwives, who straddled the line between medicine and magic, offering both herbal remedies and ritual protections. Some brothels even employed women who acted as unofficial nurses, tending to the sick with poultices, baths, or wine. The church also played a role, though not always kindly. Priests might insist that prostitutes confess their sins as a cure for illness, framing disease as divine punishment for immorality. Pilgrimages to shrines, the touching of relics, or the purchase of holy water were common remedies. Many prostitutes, desperate for relief, embraced both medicine and superstition, swallowing bitter herbs in the morning and whispering prayers to saints at night. The visible toll. Disease left marks that no rouge or ribbon could fully disguise. Scars on the skin, missing teeth, thinning hair, or a limp betrayed the body's weariness. A prostitute too visibly marked by illness could lose customers, leaving her destitute. Some tried to hide their ailments with heavy makeup or veils. Others moved to new towns where their reputation had not yet spread. But the toll was inescapable. A woman in her late 20s might look 40. A woman past 35 was often considered too old to attract many clients, regardless of her actual health. Moments of resilience. Despite the bleakness, prostitutes displayed remarkable resilience in coping with illness. Some formed small networks of mutual aid, pooling money to buy medicine or food for a sick companion. Others relied on long-term clients for support during periods of weakness. A few who survived illnesses became healers themselves, passing down knowledge of herbs, treatments, and survival strategies to younger women. Their bodies bore scars, but their experience gave them authority within the hidden world of their trade. In the end, disease was both an enemy and a constant companion. It defined the boundaries of life expectancy, shaped the rhythm of work, and reinforced society's disdain. Prostitutes were seen not only as morally corrupt, but also as physically diseased, symbols of decay. Yet behind this stigma lay the unspoken truth. They were women struggling to survive in a world that offered them few choices, their bodies paying the price for a society's hypocrisy and hunger. Violence, crime, and exploitation.
For medieval prostitutes, danger was never an abstraction. It was a constant, inescapable presence. Violence and exploitation shaped their daily lives, both on the streets and within the supposed safety of brothels. From drunken men to rival gangs, abusive pimps and enforcers, the world offered few sanctuaries for women who survived by selling their bodies. Street violence. Street prostitutes faced dangers from the moment they stepped onto the cobblestones. Alleys were dark, lanterns scarce, and watchmen often absent or indifferent. Drunken men could become aggressive, robbing or assaulting women, refusing to pay, or attacking them after brief encounters. Fights between rival men sometimes ensnared women in the crossfire. A prostitute's ability to survive often depended on vigilance, quick thinking, and alliances with fellow women. Many carried crude weapons, hidden knives, sharpened sticks, or pins to ward off attackers. Some had regular clients who acted as informal protectors, paying for companionship and shielding them from harm. Yet these protectors could just as easily become predators, exploiting the women they claimed to defend. Brothel violence. Within brothels, violence was more regulated, but no less severe. Madam or keeper enforced discipline, often through beatings or confinement. A woman who refused clients, stole money, or disobeyed rules risked punishment that could range from public humiliation to expulsion. Enforcers maintained order, using intimidation or physical coercion. Though these systems offered some protection from street crime, they also entrenched the control of pimps and madams, leaving prostitutes with little autonomy. Pimps and exploiters. Pimps were a dominant source of both protection and abuse. They demanded loyalty and a portion of earnings, using violence to enforce submission. Women who resisted could be beaten, threatened, or driven into homelessness. Exploiters often profited from multiple women at once, treating them as property. In some cases, young girls were trafficked from rural areas or orphanages, forced into the trade under the guise of guardianship. Criminalization and the law. Ironically, the law itself could be a source of violence. Prostitutes were frequently arrested for working outside designated areas or for minor infractions. Punishments included flogging, the stocks, public shaming, or banishment. In some cities, violators were paraded through streets half-naked or had their heads shaved. These punishments were designed to humiliate, deter, and reinforce social hierarchies, leaving women with both physical and psychological scars. Sexual exploitation and coercion. Sexual exploitation went beyond the market. Some clients were coercive or abusive, forcing services at gunpoint, dagger, or threat of social ruin. Clergy and nobility often used their power to obtain services without fear of consequence. The church condemned prostitution publicly, yet tolerated or profited from it privately, a hypocrisy that left women vulnerable to some of the most dangerous clients. Rivalry and theft. Competition among prostitutes could also lead to violence. Fights over lucrative territories, clients, or alliances sometimes erupted in taverns or alleys. Theft was common. A stolen purse, coin, or garment could push a woman from temporary comfort into starvation. These threats were not abstract. They were daily realities, shaping behavior, alliances, and strategies for survival. Self-protection and solidarity. Despite the dangers, prostitutes developed strategies for survival. Many worked in pairs or groups for safety, signaling warnings about dangerous clients or rival gangs. Some maintained connections with sympathetic tavern owners or alehouse keepers who offered refuge or tips. A few even carried small charms, talismans, or prayers for protection, blending superstition with practical caution. The constant presence of violence shaped not only daily routines, but also identity. Women learned to read men, anticipate threats, and endure pain without complaint. Their lives were defined by negotiation, not only for coin, but for safety, autonomy, and fleeting moments of dignity. The psychological toll. Enduring violence took a profound psychological toll. Women lived with fear, trauma, and the knowledge that society both condemned and depended on them. Many developed resilience, humor, or hardened indifference to survive. Others sank into despair, alcoholism, or drug use when available. Emotional bonds among women often became crucial lifelines. Friendship, shared stories, or small acts of kindness offered brief reprieves from a harsh reality.
In the medieval world, violence and exploitation were inescapable companions. Prostitutes were targets of assault, pawns in political or social machinations, and objects of scorn. Yet they also demonstrated remarkable endurance, navigating danger with intelligence, courage, and a fragile but persistent sense of community. Survival required constant vigilance, a sharp mind, and sometimes sheer luck, but also the quiet power of women who refused to vanish despite a society that wished they would. Relationships, lovers, and family. Despite the harsh realities of medieval prostitution, human connections, love, companionship, and family persisted in the shadows of their lives. While society often assumed prostitutes were incapable of loyalty or affection, many women maintained relationships that provided emotional support, survival strategies, or even fleeting joy. These connections could be complicated, secretive, and sometimes dangerous, but they offered moments of humanity in otherwise brutal lives. Lovers and regular clients. Some prostitutes cultivated relationships with regular clients, men who offered more than fleeting encounters. A wealthy merchant, soldier, or nobleman might become a protector, ensuring the woman had food, clothing, or temporary shelter in exchange for exclusive companionship. These arrangements were often transactional, but they could include genuine affection, gifts, or even a quasi-family arrangement. The risk in such relationships was significant. If the protector demanded loyalty or obedience, refusal could result in violence. If the protector left or died, the woman often faced destitution. Trust was a precarious commodity, and love often intertwined with survival. Yet, for some women, these bonds offered emotional respite from the daily grind of work, an opportunity to experience attention, care, or fleeting intimacy without shame.
Friendships among women. Solidarity among prostitutes was crucial. Women shared information about dangerous clients, offered financial help, or watched each other's backs in brothels and on the streets. These friendships were sometimes the closest substitute for family, providing advice, protection, and companionship. Younger women often learned survival skills, hygiene tricks, and defensive strategies from older, experienced peers. Shared laughter, stories, and gossip brought a sense of normalcy amid hardship. Family and children. Some prostitutes had children, whether born from the trade or from previous relationships. Raising children was a challenge in a society that stigmatized them, but many women created makeshift families. Brothels sometimes tolerated infants if women could care for them, and fellow women often helped. Children were sometimes left with midwives, relatives, or charitable institutions when survival required. Tragically, many children did not survive infancy due to poverty, disease, or neglect. Pregnancy was both a personal and professional risk. It limited a woman's ability to work, and in some cases, brothel keepers or pimps forced abortions. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and childbirth compounded the already high risks of disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Despite these dangers, women often attempted to maintain familial bonds wherever possible, sewing small garments, passing down advice, or whispering prayers over their children. Marriage and escape. Occasionally, a prostitute married or attempted to leave the trade. This was rare but not unheard of. Marriage offered legal protection, social acceptance, and a chance to exit a life marked by stigma. However, success depended on societal approval, financial stability, and sometimes the influence of a sympathetic protector or madam. Many women attempted escape but returned when poverty, social prejudice, or lack of skills made survival outside prostitution impossible.
Emotional survival. In a world dominated by exploitation, women often developed emotional strategies to cope. Humor, storytelling, superstition, and occasional intimacy allowed them to retain a sense of identity and humanity. The bonds they formed, whether fleeting lovers, trusted friends, or children they nurtured, were lifelines. They reminded women that even in marginalization, they could assert agency, maintain hope, and experience moments of joy. The human paradox. Relationships among prostitutes reveal a paradox. They were simultaneously marginalized and essential, despised and desired, vulnerable and resilient. Love, friendship, and family did not erase hardship, but they provided vital emotional scaffolding. In a society that sought to dehumanize them, these connections affirmed their humanity. They laughed, wept, cared, and mourned, demonstrating that even in the margins, life persisted in all its complexity. In essence, relationships were both survival and sanctuary. Lovers could protect or exploit, friends could shield or betray, and children could inspire hope or despair. For medieval prostitutes, human connections were carefully navigated, a mixture of risk and reward, necessity and desire, a reminder that even in the harshest lives, love and companionship remained vital.
Religion, repentance, and social stigma. Religion dominated every aspect of medieval life, shaping morality, law, and social norms. For prostitutes, it was both a source of oppression and a tenuous path toward survival. The church condemned them relentlessly, labeling them as sinners, corrupters of men, and agents of the devil. Yet at the same time, religion provided avenues for repentance, protection, and occasional solace in a society that sought to marginalize them. Moral condemnation. From the pulpit, priests painted prostitutes as the embodiment of vice. Sermons invoked vivid imagery of hellfire, eternal punishment, and the corruption of the soul. Prostitutes were accused of leading men astray, defiling churches, and undermining the social order. Moral texts and city ordinances reinforced this, marking women with identifying clothing or punishing them publicly for transgressions. This constant moral scrutiny ensured that women were always aware of their perceived sinfulness. Society reinforced these messages. Respectable women were advised to avoid contact with prostitutes entirely, while men were permitted clandestine indulgence, but publicly shamed for open association. In legal documents, prostitutes were often described as fallen, a permanent label that carried lifelong social consequences. Confession and repentance. Despite condemnation, the church offered a path to temporary absolution. Confession allowed women to unburden themselves, sometimes in exchange for penance, fasting, pilgrimages, or corporal punishment. Some madams encouraged their workers to confess regularly, both to appease church authorities and to maintain a semblance of moral standing.
However, repentance rarely freed women from social stigma. Even those who confessed and sought forgiveness were still restricted by laws, societal judgment, and the economic realities of their trade. A repentant prostitute could be absolved spiritually, but not socially. Her body remained a target for exploitation, and her status remained low. Religious orders and protection. In rare cases, nuns and religious orders offered refuge. Convents sometimes provided shelter for women wishing to leave prostitution, particularly older women or those who had been coerced into the trade. Such transitions were difficult, requiring approval from church authorities and the ability to live under strict vows. Yet for some, this provided the only path to a life outside the streets and brothels. Religious rituals also offered private comfort. Pilgrimages, prayers, charms, and holy water were common tools of protection. Many prostitutes carried small crucifixes, blessed coins, or amulets to ward off disease, evil spirits, or violent clients. Faith, intertwined with superstition, became a survival mechanism as much as a moral practice. Social stigma and public shaming. The church reinforced social stigma through public shaming. Women caught violating laws, practicing without authorization, or engaging in street solicitation could face flogging, head shaving, or forced parades through town squares. These punishments were designed to humiliate and reinforce hierarchy, marking prostitutes as morally and socially inferior. Even when legal or religious authorities tolerated prostitution as a necessary evil, social attitudes remained harsh. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and clients alike treated women with disdain or distrust. Gossip, rumor, and public judgment created invisible barriers, isolating women and limiting their options for safety, work, or personal relationships.
Religion as negotiation. Despite condemnation, prostitutes learned to navigate the religious landscape. They attended Mass selectively, confessed strategically, and participated in festivals to avoid scrutiny. Religion became a tool for survival, not merely devotion. By showing outward piety or adhering to church rules superficially, women could gain temporary protection from fines, beatings, or social censure. Psychological impact. The relentless moral scrutiny and spiritual pressure imposed deep psychological effects. Many women internalized shame, believing themselves inherently sinful. Others developed resilience, compartmentalizing faith and survival. Some rejected religious authority entirely, while others used it pragmatically, finding comfort or leverage in a system that otherwise oppressed them. The paradox of faith. For medieval prostitutes, religion was both weapon and refuge. It condemned and punished, yet offered absolution and shelter. It reinforced social hierarchy, yet provided a framework through which women could negotiate survival. Faith shaped their lives, dictated behavior, and influenced their relationships, all while being intertwined with the stigma that defined their existence. In essence, religion was inseparable from the life of a prostitute. It dictated how society viewed them, how they viewed themselves, and how they navigated the dangerous, morally complex world around them. For women living on the margins, faith was not simply a matter of belief. It was survival, identity, and a fragile hope for redemption.
Urban versus rural life. How location shaped their lives. The life of a medieval prostitute varied greatly depending on location. While poverty, disease, and social stigma were common threads,
Whether a woman lived in a bustling city or a quiet rural village shaped her work, risks, and opportunities. Urban centers offered more clients, but greater competition, legal restrictions, and surveillance, while rural areas provided relative anonymity, but fewer resources and greater vulnerability.
Rural life. In contrast, rural prostitutes faced fewer clients, but also less oversight. Villages and small towns lacked municipal brothels, meaning women often worked independently or under the protection of a local patron. This autonomy could be empowering, but also perilous. Without a madam or enforcer, women were more exposed to violence from clients, rival men, or law enforcement. Shelter options were limited. Many slept in barns, outbuildings, or rented rooms in taverns, often in poor condition. Rural areas sometimes offered anonymity. A woman could work in one village, move to another nearby town, and avoid a reputation that might otherwise follow her. Yet isolation also meant fewer allies and less access to medical care, herbs, or assistance from fellow women. Economic instability was greater. Harvest cycles, seasonal fairs, or the presence of traveling merchants often dictated income. In times of scarcity, survival became even more precarious. Mobility and migration. Many prostitutes migrated between rural and urban areas in search of work or safety. Young women from villages often moved to cities to escape poverty, limited opportunities, or abusive households. Cities offered income potential, yet required navigating legal restrictions and dangerous social hierarchies. Conversely, some women fled cities to avoid legal persecution, epidemics, or violent clients, returning to rural areas for temporary respite. Mobility carried risks. Travel was hazardous, roads were poorly maintained, bandits common, and inns often unsafe. Women who moved frequently had to adapt quickly to local customs, establish client bases, and find temporary shelter. Yet movement also allowed them to escape abusive pimps, avoid disease outbreaks, or seek fresh opportunities.
Cultural differences. Location also influenced social attitudes. In urban centers, prostitution was often regulated and tacitly accepted as a necessary social institution, whereas in rural villages, women might face harsher judgment and social ostracism. Religious and civic authorities in cities had more structured enforcement mechanisms. In rural areas, moral policing was often informal, but no less effective, relying on gossip, family networks, and local clergy. Daily life contrasts. Urban prostitutes experienced structured chaos, regulated brothels, street corners crowded with competitors, municipal oversight, and a constant stream of clients. Rural prostitutes lived in sparse, unpredictable conditions, fewer clients, less oversight,
but greater personal vulnerability. Both environments required vigilance, resourcefulness, and resilience, but the nature of danger and opportunity shifted dramatically with geography. Conclusion. In the medieval world, geography shaped prostitution as much as social hierarchy or law. Urban centers provided opportunity and danger in equal measure, while rural life offered relative freedom coupled with isolation and scarcity. For women navigating these worlds, survival depended on understanding the terrain, knowing where to work, when to move, and whom to trust. Urban or rural, the daily struggle remained constant, yet the landscape dictated the strategies, risks, and occasional reprieves available to women living on society's margins. Seasonal work and economic fluctuations. In the medieval era, prostitution was not a static profession. Income, workload, and survival were deeply influenced by seasonal changes, economic cycles, and social events. For women working on the margins of society, understanding these fluctuations was essential. Misjudging the rhythm of the year could mean hunger, exposure, or illness. The rhythms of the year, agricultural cycles dictated the movement and wealth of populations. During planting and harvest seasons, peasants and laborers were preoccupied, leaving fewer potential clients in towns and villages. Conversely, after harvest, when money flowed from grain sales and fairs, demand for entertainment, including prostitution, rose sharply. Traveling merchants, soldiers returning from campaigns, and visiting nobility injected coin into local economies, creating windows of relative prosperity for prostitutes. Fairs and festivals were a boon for women in the trade. Markets and festivals attracted crowds from distant regions, bringing men with coins to spend and fewer local reputational constraints. These gatherings provided opportunities for higher earnings, but also exposed women to new risks. Large crowds meant increased competition, pickpockets, and the threat of violent clients. The chaos of fairs demanded vigilance, quick decision-making, and the ability to negotiate fees efficiently. Religious festivals also influenced activity. During Lent or other periods of fasting, demand sometimes dropped, as men were encouraged to abstain. Conversely, carnival and feast days often saw a surge in indulgence, with drinking, gambling, and sexual activity peaking in urban streets and taverns. Skilled prostitutes timed their work to align with these periods, maximizing income when society's moral restraints were temporarily loosened. Economic downturns. Economic hardship, such as poor harvests, inflation, or war, disproportionately affected prostitutes. Coin became scarce, and clients could no longer afford regular visits. Brothel keepers and pimps often passed these shortfalls onto women, demanding the same rent or fees despite lower income. Street workers might face hunger, exposure, or debt. Some were forced to accept barter, trading sexual services for food, clothing, or temporary shelter. Urban versus rural impact. Seasonal fluctuations affected urban and rural prostitutes differently. In cities, fairs and markets provided predictable spikes of opportunity. Brothels could adjust by rotating women, raising fees, or expanding hours temporarily. Rural women had fewer clients year-round and were more vulnerable during economic downturns, relying on transient travelers for income. Mobility, therefore, became a survival strategy as women moved between towns or villages to find temporary prosperity. Weather and work conditions. Seasons also affected physical work conditions.
Winter brought cold, snow, and harsh winds, making street work dangerous and sometimes impossible. Frozen streets limited travel, and frozen rivers hindered trade, reducing the number of potential clients. Women without shelter faced hypothermia or death. Summer, while warmer, brought heat, disease, and overcrowding, increasing exposure to illness. Rain or floods could make streets impassable, while urban alleys turned into mud traps, limiting accessibility for both clients and prostitutes.
Adapting to fluctuations. Experienced women developed strategies to navigate these cycles. They saved coins during periods of high demand, stockpiled food, or secured temporary lodging. Some diversified their services, offering domestic help, laundry, or other work to supplement income during slow periods. Others built relationships with patrons or influential clients who provided consistent support regardless of seasonal shifts. Psychological toll of instability. The unpredictability of income and workload created constant anxiety. Hunger, illness, or unpaid rent loomed as tangible threats during lean periods. Many women developed mental resilience, using humor, superstition, or social bonds to cope with the uncertainty. Those who failed to adapt often faced severe consequences: eviction, illness, or coercion by exploiters. Conclusion: seasonal and economic fluctuations were a hidden force shaping the lives of medieval prostitutes. Prosperity came in brief, intense waves, while scarcity loomed as a constant threat. Understanding the cycles of agriculture, trade, festivals, and weather allowed women to maximize earnings, protect themselves, and navigate danger. Survival was not merely a matter of skill or morality. It was a careful balancing act with the rhythms of the wider medieval world. Legal systems, punishments, and rights. In the medieval world, prostitutes existed under constant legal scrutiny. While their work was often tolerated as a necessary evil, it was also tightly regulated, controlled, and punished when perceived as a threat to morality or public order. Understanding the legal environment is crucial to grasp how these women navigated survival, risk, and limited agency. Regulation and municipal oversight. Many cities recognized prostitution as an inevitable part of urban life. Municipal authorities sometimes regulated brothels, licensing madams, taxing profits, and setting rules for operations. Florence, Nuremberg, and Paris had official red light districts, while in London, prostitution was monitored but largely restricted to certain areas. Licenses, however, were rarely granted to individual women. They were typically issued to brothel keepers or madams. Women working independently often operated illegally, risking arrest, fines, or physical punishment. These regulations created a paradox. Prostitution was legally recognized, yet morally condemned, leaving women perpetually vulnerable to both civic and ecclesiastical authorities. Punishments for violations. Legal penalties were severe and public. Women caught soliciting outside sanctioned areas might face flogging, the stocks, head shaving, or banishment. Fines were common, but often impossible to pay without support from a madam or client. Repeat offenders risked harsher punishments, including imprisonment, public humiliation, or corporal punishment. Some towns introduced corporal methods intended to shame and deter. In Florence, a woman might be paraded through the streets wearing identifying garments or signs proclaiming her status.
In England, fines were accompanied by whippings or temporary imprisonment. The visibility of punishment reinforced the social hierarchy and moral codes, ensuring that prostitutes remained marginalized even when tolerated. Sexual exploitation within the law. Legal authorities sometimes worked against prostitutes in subtle ways. Officials, clergy, and nobility often enjoyed impunity for exploiting women, while the women themselves were punished for minor infractions. Laws favored those in power, leaving prostitutes with few options for redress when assaulted, cheated, or coerced. In some regions, local courts intervened only when disputes threatened economic order. If a client refused payment, if a woman worked outside designated zones, or if a brothel violated regulations. Otherwise, abuses went unchecked. This imbalance reinforced the systemic exploitation women faced, entrenching vulnerability as part of their daily lives. Rights and limitations. Prostitutes had few formal rights. Some cities allowed women to testify in court against theft or assault, but legal standing was limited. Brothel workers under municipal oversight might have basic protections, rules against excessively violent clients, for example, but these were minimal and often unenforced. Women outside brothels were largely unprotected, relying on allies, patrons, or informal social networks for safety.
Ownership of property was rare. Brothels themselves were considered commercial enterprises, and women rarely held personal claim to space, coin, or tools of trade. A madam or pimp often controlled earnings, shelter, and work assignments. Women might petition courts for stolen money or wrongful eviction, but success was uncommon. Ecclesiastical influence. Church courts intersected with civic law, emphasizing moral regulation. Penalties could include penance, public humiliation, or religious rituals designed to shame. Priests might impose fasting, confession, or pilgrimages as punishment for sexual sin. While these were spiritual penalties, they were deeply intertwined with social control, reinforcing stigma and limiting women's freedom. Negotiation within the legal system. Experienced prostitutes often learned to navigate legal frameworks. They might work within sanctioned districts, maintain good relations with enforcers, or pay bribes to avoid fines. Knowledge of local rules, curfews, required garments, brothel hours was crucial. Women who understood the law could sometimes use it to protect themselves or their earnings, though such victories were fragile and temporary. Education, literacy, and skill. Medieval prostitutes were often assumed to be uneducated and unskilled, but their survival depended on a set of practical knowledge and abilities that went beyond the physical. Literacy was rare, yet many women developed functional skills, social intelligence, and business acumen necessary to navigate a harsh and complex world. Understanding how education, or the lack of it, shaped their lives provides insight into their resilience and agency.
Limited formal education. Most prostitutes came from lower-class backgrounds, where formal education was a luxury. Rural girls rarely attended school, and even urban daughters of artisans or merchants might only learn basic reading, counting, or domestic skills. For many, literacy was optional at best and inaccessible at worst. The church provided instruction for children in religious matters, but these lessons rarely translated into functional skills for economic independence. Practical knowledge and street literacy. Despite limited formal education, prostitutes often developed a practical literacy suited to survival. They learned to read coins, weights, and measures to negotiate transactions. They memorized laws, curfews, and local ordinances to avoid arrest. Urban women learned the geography of streets, taverns, and brothels, understanding which areas offered clients protection or danger. Some women could read simple texts, such as prayer books or signage, while others relied on memory and oral instruction. This functional literacy allowed them to navigate complex social and legal landscapes, maintain accounts of earnings, and communicate effectively with clients, madams, or allies. Numeracy and financial skills. Prostitution required constant negotiation and financial management. Women calculated fees, made change, saved coins for lean periods, and sometimes invested in clothing, food, or small charms for protection. Experienced prostitutes tracked clients, remembered payment history, and assessed risk versus reward for different situations. These were practical skills, rarely acknowledged by society, yet essential for survival.
Social intelligence and negotiation. Perhaps more important than literacy was social intelligence. Prostitutes had to read clients' intentions, detect danger, and adapt behavior accordingly. Persuasion, flattery, and discretion were tools as vital as any weapon. Women memorized the social hierarchies of their communities, identifying influential patrons, understanding family dynamics, and negotiating relationships to maximize safety and profit. They also cultivated the ability to perform emotional labor, feigning interest, tempering anger, and managing conflict. The ability to charm, manipulate, or empathize with clients could make the difference between a night of earnings or a night of risk. This skill set was learned through observation, experience, and mentorship, often from older women in the trade.
The role of superstition and oral tradition. In addition to practical skills, women inherited knowledge of herbs, charms, and folk remedies, a combination of medicine, superstition, and tradition. These practices allowed them to manage minor ailments, stave off disease, or create a sense of control in a chaotic environment. Oral traditions also carried advice on legal navigation, rivalries, and survival tactics that formal education rarely provided. After exploring the lives of medieval prostitutes across 25 detailed parts, one truth emerges clearly. These women lived in the margins of society, constantly negotiating survival, morality, and autonomy in a world that simultaneously exploited and condemned them. Their experiences were shaped by poverty, disease, violence, law, religion, and social prejudice. But within these constraints, they exhibited extraordinary resilience, resourcefulness, and humanity. Survival and agency. Medieval prostitutes were not merely victims. Their survival depended on intelligence, strategy, and skill. They mastered the geography of cities and villages, navigated legal and religious restrictions, managed clients and finances, and built networks of protection and solidarity. Every day was a negotiation between danger and opportunity, shame and dignity, fear and fleeting joy. Humanity in hardship. Beyond survival, these women demonstrated remarkable capacity for emotional life. They formed friendships, nurtured children, maintained lovers or regular clients, and relied on each other for care, guidance, and protection. Humor, superstition, rituals, and small comforts provided psychological resilience. Even in a society that dehumanized them, they retained a sense of identity, community, and agency. Legacy and reflection. History often remembers prostitutes through the lens of morality, law, or scandal. But their lived experiences offer valuable insight into the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the medieval world. They were participants in a complex system of commerce, labor, and social negotiation. Their struggles highlight broader issues of gender, power, and inequality, while their strategies reveal human ingenuity in the face of oppression. Outro message. The story of medieval prostitutes is not merely about vice. It is a story of survival, resilience, and humanity under extreme conditions. These women endured hunger, disease, violence, and stigma, yet found ways to protect themselves, earn a living, and navigate a harsh world. Their lives remind us that even in societies that marginalize or condemn, human beings will adapt, resist, and persist. In learning about these lives, we gain a deeper understanding of medieval society, not only its laws, morals, and economy, but also its hidden margins and the women who lived there. Their stories are painful, complex, and often overlooked, yet they are an essential part of history, offering lessons about resilience, agency, and the human capacity to survive against overwhelming odds. Final reflection. As we close this exploration, remember that history is not only the stories of kings, nobles, and battles. It is also the stories of women whose lives were lived quietly, painfully, yet courageously in the shadows. The lives of medieval prostitutes remind us that survival is an act of intelligence, courage, and endurance. They faced the world with limited choices, yet their agency and resilience shine through the centuries.